Denise Blair, and I'm the Director of Education here at the Michigan State University Museum. Welcome, please come in. And we are just so happy to have you all here tonight. This is a really nice opportunity for us to welcome you into our space, to the program tonight. I want to say that it is a partnership of the African Studies Center on the Ubuntu Dialogues project, and we're happy to host you tonight and to be able to have you explore our spaces. Hopefully after the talk is finished this evening. We are open until 8 p.m., so it's an opportunity for you to explore once that is finished. For those of you who don't know much about the MSU Museum, we are one of the oldest museums in the Midwest. We've been around since 1857. So if you know your MSU history, that's just 2 years after the university itself was founded. And we do a lot of different kinds of things here. Of course, talks like this and welcoming our MSU community here is one of the biggest things that we do. We also work with professors, academic staff, and students, and have many classes come here. So if you are interested in coming back and bringing students, we'd be happy to work with you on that. We also do a lot of different kinds of research, and tonight is just kind of a showcase of that. Also showcasing research that we do in social science, natural science, archaeology, anthropology, and I do educational research here. So it's a wonderful place where a lot of different kinds of things come together for scholarship and talking about different kinds of things. So it's an exciting place to work, an exciting place to be, and we're so delighted that you're here with us tonight. I also would like to acknowledge that this work emerges out of the foundations of work that's been done by Drs. Kurt Dewhurst and Marcia McDowell, who are connected with the MSU Museum. And also just to mention that the talk will have a chance for you to ask questions at the end. So please feel welcome to do that. When you're exploring tonight, I do want to point out we still have our Finding Our Voice exhibit here, which was co-curated with the sister survivors from the Nasser crisis. And it does get into the history of what happened and also a nice focus on hope and healing. So if you go into that space, I encourage you, there is a trigger warning, so please read that and exercise self-care as you're going through that exhibit, but it is definitely worth it for you to see if you're able to do that tonight. Also, we just opened Righting a Wrong about Japanese internment camps, which is downstairs on the ground floor, so you're welcome to take a look at that as well. And so now I'm going to turn it over to our Jay. You said that you wanted to be informal tonight, so we'll come up and introduce our speaker. So thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much. We are so grateful to the museum to allow us to come and do this event here. And I also want to welcome you to this event. I will say a few things about the Ubuntu Dialogues project before or as a way of introducing the speaker. And as you just heard, the Ubuntu Dialogues is a partnership that's between the MSU African Studies Program and the Stellenbosch University Museum, and this is funded by the Mellon Foundation. This project is currently being run out of the African Studies Center, but it's really a work of collaboration between a number of units on campus, including the MSU Museum, including the library, as well as Matrix and Broad Museum. And there's a couple other units that are also here on campus, so it's not just one unit. And what we are trying to do with the partnership is to establish or strengthen existing relationships and connections between universities and communities, both here in here in the US and also in South Africa. And we have three components to the project. The first one is the seminar speaker series that you are part of this afternoon. But we also have a student exchange program where we send 10 students from MSU to Cape Town to intern in museums and heritage sites in Cape Town. We also host 10 students from Stellenbosch, and that program is going to happen in the summer. The third component of the program is what we call virtual student dialogues, where we put students in a room here in MSU, same students we put also students in a room in Cape Town, and then they actually talk in real time about issues that they care about across the Atlantic. And what I wanted to point out is today's seminar is a third of what we have done so far. We have had 2 seminars, and I wanted to at least pull this up so that you have a visual sense of what we've been doing. So today is the third. The first one that we had happened in September 2019, where we had Professor Kumla Gobodo-Madikizela from Stellenbosch as well, and she spoke on forgiveness, reparations, and trauma. Then the second one happened in November. We had Funzo Sidogi, who is a PhD student, and he also spoke about issues around Ubuntu aesthetics, focusing on 20th century urban South Africa, and very fascinating speech that we had, or presentation from him. So this afternoon we are going to focus on a third one that we are going to hear about in a little bit. But before we do that, I wanted to also point out that we are hosting speakers from Cape Town here, but we are also sending speakers to Cape Town. And before I show you the speakers we are sending to Cape Town, we do have 2 more coming from Stellenbosch. The next one is coming and speaking March on the 17th, and we are going to again bring people here for that conversation. Then the last one coming from Stellenbosch in the spring is coming in April, and they are going to talk here April 7th. And we are also sending a couple of our own people to Stellenbosch. This is the first semester that we are sending people to Stellenbosch, and we have 4 of them going in the spring. The first one is actually very fascinating because she graduated here with a PhD, Emily Diouf, and she'll be the first speaker going to Stellenbosch, and she's speaking about a week from now, February 20. Then we also have someone February 27, another one in April, and another one in May. So this is a very comprehensive program that we are involved with, and I wanted you to get a sense of what we are doing. Now I want to turn to the speaker in the seminar for today, Inga. I'm not going to say her last name. She's going to teach us how to say her last name because I don't want to mess up with it. So she's going to tell us her last name. But she is currently completing a Master's of Law degree at Stellenbosch University. She is a member of the Golden Key International Honors Society, and from 2016 to 2018, she was the project manager of the Constitutional Literacy and Service Initiative. In this role, she recruited law students, she organized lesson plans, and facilitated the program of teaching constitutional law, especially the Bill of Rights, to under-resourced high schools in surrounding Stellenbosch areas. She has also worked at 2 prominent law clinics that specialize in providing legal advice and legal representation to marginalized people in marginalized communities. She is currently a candidate attorney at Norton Rose Fulbright, and I think she will talk a little bit about that. The title of her presentation today is Opportunities and Challenges of Ubuntu in the South African Land Reform Context. Please join me in extending a very warm welcome to Inga as she comes to speak to us.
Thank you. That was very nice.
Give me 1 moment to pull out the slides.
Hi everyone. Let me just see if I know how to work this. Okay, perfect. We fine? It's on? Okay. Good afternoon everyone. My name is Inga Dyantyi. Dyantyi, that's how you say my surname. Upenyu. I am a second-year Master of Law student at Stellenbosch University. I'm also a candidate attorney, which is, not sure what you know what that is, but when you complete your law degree in South Africa, you have to do your articles of clerkship. So I'm doing mine at a firm, an international firm. They have it here in the US as well, called Norton Rose Fulbright. And yeah, my master's thesis explores the question of the opportunities and challenges that could result from the application of Ubuntu in a land reform context in South Africa. I chose this particular topic because land reform is an incredibly contentious subject matter in South Africa today, and I believe that Ubuntu could possibly facilitate a more compassionate and collaborative approach to land reform. So in this presentation today, I will discuss, firstly, the history of dispossession in South Africa, the current land reform program that was established to redress that history, and then I will discuss Ubuntu and the ways in which it relates to my study. So I will discuss Ubuntu as a socio-cultural value, then I will discuss it as a legal value, then I will try to show the ways in which it relates to land reform. Okay. The history of dispossession in South Africa starts in 1652. In 1652, a group of Dutch settlers arrived in the Cape of Good Hope, which is now known as Cape Town. They arrived under the auspices of the Dutch East India Company. The official reason for their settlement was that South Africa was to act as a refreshment station for passing ships. Now, as the Dutch settlement grew, so did their desire for land. So they began, through war, through conquest, through negotiations, to dispossess the Khoi people that they had found in the Cape of Good Hope. As the Dutch settlement grew, so did their desire for land. So they began moving northwards in South Africa. And there they met the Bantu people, the black people of South Africa, and they made resistance. So starting from 1779 to 1879, there was 100 years of war in South Africa waged over land. The Dutch people wanting to take land from the indigenous people resisting. In the background of all of this, the British arrived in South Africa. So from 1795 to 1806, the Dutch and the British begrudgingly exchanged ownership over South Africa. In 1902, the Anglo-Boer War happened. The Anglo-Boer War happened, or the South African War, as it's also known. So what happened is the Dutch people, who at that time had self-identified as Afrikaners, or the Boer, waged war against the British because they didn't want to be governed by the British. So the Anglo-Boer War happened in 1902. The result of this war was that South Africa broke into 4 independent republics: the Orange Free State, the Transvaal, the Cape, the Natal. So the Cape and Natal were governed by the British. The Transvaal and Orange Free State were governed by the Dutch. This all changed again in 1910, because in 1910, the Union of South Africa was formed. So South Africa became one. All 4 independent republics became one Union of South Africa, and this was governed by the British. In the Union of South Africa, black people were not citizens. They had been banished to the outskirts of the country, the rural, impoverished, under-resourced outskirts of the country, and they were not citizens of the Union of South Africa. The 1913 Native Land Act decided that there were residential areas for black people, residential areas for colored people. By the way, colored doesn't mean in South Africa what it means here, just so we are clear. So colored in South Africa is a racial classification. So colored people are mixed race people. It's not a slur in South Africa like it is here. Okay, so just to be safe. So there were areas, so white people had to live in white areas, black people had to live in black areas, colored people had to live in colored areas, Indian people had to live in Indian areas. That was the Group Areas Act. And this era also led to a lot of forced removals, because what happened is, if you were a colored person living in an area that was suddenly classified as a white area, you had to move. So for example, District 6, that's what happened in District 6. So colored people lived in that area, then suddenly the government decided it was a white area, so the colored people had to move. They were given a time period to relocate. If you failed to relocate within that time period, you were forcibly removed. As you can imagine, this act led to a lot of social, psychological, and economic damage in South Africa in general, but especially in colored and Indian communities, because they were the ones in urban areas, because black people, as you will remember, were in the outskirts of the country at that point. So the cumulative effect of all these racially discriminatory laws is that this is how South Africa looks today. So by the end of apartheid, by the fall of apartheid in 1994, black people, who are an overwhelming majority in South Africa, I would say 80% of the population in South Africa is black, owned less than 15% of the total land available, and white people, who are a minority in South Africa, owned the majority of the land. So this was a Time magazine cover last year. So this is South Africa. As you will see, this side, the leafy suburb, it's a white suburb. This side, smaller plots, dirty, overpopulated, it's a black township, separated by a road. This is a common view in South Africa. So this is Joburg, this is Cape Town, same thing. This is a black township in South Africa. It's a black township in South Africa. So this is the effect of racially discriminatory laws in the colonial and apartheid eras. So in 1994, at the collapse of apartheid, the democratically elected ANC government embarked on a land reform program to redress all of this, or to attempt to redress all of this. So the land reform program in South Africa, more South Africa. So the land reform program in South Africa has 3 sub-programs. Has 3 sub-programs. So there's land restitution, there's land redistribution, and there's tenure reform. So this program is constitutionally based, and it also exists in legislation. So tenure reform I don't discuss in my study, so I'll not discuss that today. If you want to know what it is, you can ask me afterwards, but I'll not discuss it in this presentation, okay? So land restitution is contained in section 25(5) of the Constitution, and land restitution means the return of land, or otherwise the payment of compensation to those who were dispossessed because of past racially discriminatory laws. Land redistribution concerns the empowerment of those who were historically excluded to be able to purchase land. So restitution has to do with returning land, redistribution has to do with opening up access to land. Okay, they're similar, but they're different, okay? The land reform program in South Africa, this program that was initiated in 1994, is failing. This is not even an argument, a debate, it's a well-accepted fact that this program is failing, because this is how South Africa looks still today. That Time magazine cover was in 2019. So 25 years into democracy, 25 years into land reform, this is still South Africa, the most unequal society in the world. The different ways in which land reform is failing are numerous. They varied. So it's too slow, number one. So the government fails to meet its own targets as to how much land is to be transferred by a certain time. So it's too slow. It's too expensive, because the government embarked on a willing seller, willing buyer approach to land reform, where the government buys land back from people who were beneficiaries of injustice. So they buy this land back at market value prices. So it's very expensive. There's corruption in the process. There's political elite capture, where the political elite benefit the most from land reform. There's gender misrepresentation, where it's men who benefit the most from land reform. There are so many issues to land reform. I could go on. You know, it's a whole thesis on itself. But the point is, I believe that Ubuntu is part of the solution of providing a more creative, a multi-layered, a more compassionate and collaborative approach to land reform. So what is Ubuntu? So Ubuntu exists as both a social cultural value and as a legal value. Ubuntu is a sub-Saharan African philosophy that exists, like I said, as a social cultural value and as a legal value in South Africa. But the essence of Ubuntu is often captured in the Nguni maxim that says umntu ngumntu ngabantu, which directly translates to a person is a person through other persons, or I am because you are. So in my study, I argue that I am because you are, a person is a person through other persons, contains the 3 building components of Ubuntu. So firstly, I argue that Ubuntu has a notion of personhood that is dependent on how one relates to others. So in an Ubuntu-based society, you are not born a person, you become a person through acting like a person. So you become a person by being compassionate, by being humane, by sharing with others. In an Ubuntu-based society, there's group solidarity and there's communitarianism. In other words, the community's interests are paramount. So what is best for the community is what should be done. As an example, so I give examples in my study to show Ubuntu in practice in modern day South Africa. So I say that Ubuntu is evident in child rearing practices in South Africa, in funeral arrangements, in burial societies, and in stokvels, in the existence of stokvels in South Africa. Let me explain. So in terms of child rearing practices, so in African Black society, in South African society, a child belongs to everyone in the community. So in the absence of the biological parents, a child can be nurtured and cared for by anyone in the community. By the same token, a child can be disciplined by anyone in the community. In terms of funerals, when there's been a death in a community in Black South Africa, the community, the neighbors in the surrounding areas contribute food, cutlery, furniture, social capital in terms of cooking and slaughtering for that family to show support and solidarity to the bereaved family. In terms of burial societies, so in South Africa there are burial societies and there are stokvels. So burial societies is when community members get together and they put money together. So 100 Rand, or I don't know, dollars, token rands. So 100 Rand or like 200 Rand every month. And then when the death occurs, whoever has experienced a death gets payment from the burial society. So those are community members getting together to support each other in a form of informal social security. Same with stokvels. So stokvels are like a burial society, but they're not for funerals. So if you have a wedding or a child going to school soon, or you're gonna go on holiday or whatever, you and your friends or community members get together and you put money together. And when your turn comes, you get that money and you do whatever needs to be done. So that is the community aspect, that is Ubuntu. Now, in as much as Ubuntu is a social cultural value, it's also a legal value in South Africa. Ubuntu first appeared in the South African legal system in the post-amble of the interim constitution. So at the fall of apartheid in the early 90s, there was an interim government and there was also an interim constitution. So the post-amble of the constitution stated that there was a need for understanding but not for vengeance, a need for reparation but not retaliation, a need for Ubuntu but not for victimization. Now Ubuntu was not, this post-amble and Ubuntu was not included in the final constitution in South Africa. The reasons for this omission are not clear. Some believe that this shows that the constitution was westernized or de-Africanized in its redrafting process. Whatever the case may be, Ubuntu has appeared numerous times in case law in South Africa. So various cases, various judgments discuss and make reference to Ubuntu. I have chosen to focus on 4 particular judgments for purposes of my study. And these are State versus Makwanyane, Port Elizabeth Municipality versus various occupiers, AfriForum versus Malema, Tikoko versus Mokatla. So, in State versus Makwanyane, this is the first judgment of the Constitutional Court in South Africa. So the Constitutional Court is the highest level of the judiciary in South Africa. So in deciding that the death penalty was no longer appropriate in the new South Africa, the court made frequent references to Ubuntu. The court held, example, Langa J, Justice Langa, held that an important and remarkable aspect of Ubuntu is the emphasis that it places on human dignity and on life. As such, treatment that was cruel, inhumane, and degrading was bereft of Ubuntu and not appropriate in the new South Africa. In Port Elizabeth versus various occupiers, I'm discussing these cases very briefly because, I mean, no one wants a legal analysis. I'm just going to touch on the, okay. In Port Elizabeth Municipality versus various occupiers, this concerned an eviction matter. So what happens in South Africa, this is a common thing called land grab. I don't like that, but that's what it's called. So what happened is there was a vacant plot of land And people, because there's a need for land, a need for housing in South Africa, people put up their shacks on that vacant plot of land. And then a private owner appeared saying that they own the land, which it turned out they did. The occupiers were black, as you can imagine. The owner was white, as you can imagine, because of the history I just explained. So the owner took the matter to court, asking for an eviction order to evict all of these people. So the Constitutional Court, Sachs-J, refused to grant this eviction order because he said that we need to interpret our eviction law in an Ubuntu-inspired way. So instead, the court asked the government to compensate the landowner for his land, and then the people would stay because it was the government's responsibility to ensure housing to the citizens. In AfriForum versus Malema, Julius Malema is a political figure in South Africa. So he sang a song, a struggle song, during one of his campaigns that says, "Shoot the Boer." So this was a song that was sang during the apartheid era in South Africa. So the Boer are Afrikaners, and it's a struggle song. It's a freedom liberation song. So he sang the song, and AfriForum, an Afrikaner interest group in South Africa, took him to court, saying that this was hate speech. So the Equality Court identified 12 principles of Ubuntu, and on the basis of these principles, decided that this was indeed hate speech. I will note that this case has been criticized heavily in South Africa, so if you want to discuss that afterwards, we can. In Tikoko versus Mokatla, this matter involved defamation law. So in the dissenting minority judgments, Sachs-J, Mokgoro-J held that defamation law should have a more Ubuntu-inspired perspective because of the emphasis that Ubuntu places on restorative justice and on repairing relationships. The application of Ubuntu in case law has not been without criticism. There have been multiple criticisms leveled against applying Ubuntu and its meaning in case law. I'll not address these criticisms right now, but if you want to discuss them afterwards, we can. Right now, I want to highlight the aims of Ubuntu as has emerged in case law and in academic literature. So as shown in case law and academic literature, Ubuntu is concerned with the acknowledgement of truth, historical and otherwise, restorative and redistributive justice, the promotion of reconciliation and harmony. And because the promotion of reconciliation and harmony is untenable in a grossly unequal society like South Africa, it becomes important to consider the opportunities that Ubuntu has to offer in contentious areas of the law, in contentious areas of society, such as in land reform. And that is what my study attempts to do. To conclude, I leave you with this quote that I like by Professor Nanya Bolamula, a South African, who says, "If we dare to ask what good we are without others, if we dare to imagine a revitalized philosophy of Ubuntu, we may have stories worth telling future generations of South Africans." Thank you. So this is the part where I take your questions. Any question, like about land reform, about Ubuntu, about South Africa in general, about reconciliation, because I know some of you are doing that in class. Yes?
What do you think some of the challenges are to implement Ubuntu in a different culture that doesn't have that already, from a legal standpoint, in a place like the US?
It's a difficult question. I think it's very difficult because there must be some notion of what you're talking about. You know, there must be some level of understanding, and the US it's very different compared to South Africa and Africa in general. So I think it's difficult, but it's possible because even in South Africa, South Africa is quite westernized as a society, but because it's a black majority country, it's easier and people know what you're talking about. Like, unomzamo here, when I say Ubuntu, I don't even need to explain, you know, even though it's not a tangible concept, like she knows exactly what I mean because, you know, it's the things you hear in the taxi, like because of the crime, I don't know if you know about the crime rates in South Africa, the gender-based violence, everything that's happening there. But people often say those things are happening because we've lost Ubuntu, you know. So it's something that is so so integral. Like people know exactly, like it's a big part of the society, of people's understanding of, you know, humanity. So I think it'll be very difficult to sort of translate that to the US. Not impossible, just difficult. Yeah. Yeah.
Does the white minority recognize, and to what extent does the white minority recognize the principle of Ubuntu?
Yeah, okay. Let's go to the criticisms. I got my chance. Okay, so a lot of white academics argue that Ubuntu is one redundant as a value because they say that our constitution already has human dignity, respect, equality. What value does Ubuntu add when it already has those other things that seem to be saying the same thing? Which it's fair to say, but my argument is that Ubuntu constitutes a harmonization of these Western values with African values, which is a good thing because it legitimates our constitution and it renders it more inclusive. So that's the first thing. Another criticism is that they say that Ubuntu is romanticized and outdated, which, I mean, I gave examples of stokvels that are happening right now in South Africa, burial societies that are happening right now in South Africa, you know, child rearing practices. So I don't think it's romanticized, I don't think it's outdated. But even if we were to say, for argument's sake, it is outdated, I don't think that precludes the value it has to add, nor does it stop us from reviving it through institutionalizing it and applying it in areas such as land reform. So, yeah.
I have a question for you, but first, just thank you so much for this presentation. I think your work is just really significant, and I know there's a lot more to it that you couldn't share. So I wonder if you could say something more about what your dream would be of the implementation of your research. Would you like to see the policy on land reflecting Ubuntu, or do you see it more in the courts, as you said, sort of where there are court cases that are being resolved, they should be resolved with Ubuntu principles?
That's a good question. So currently the chapter I'm working on is a recommendations chapter. So this is when I don't know, like it's fun to point out issues. Like it's very nice, like, oh, this is an issue, this is an issue. When it's time to like put up solutions, that's a more difficult thing to do, I found, in writing a thesis. Like I liked complaining more. Like that was more fun. Now I must recommend stuff. But my vision is that I see it in policy. So I think because there are three like arms of the state. So there's the executive, like the government. There's like the legislature, and then there's the judiciary. I think the judiciary is limited in what they can do. You know, they can't create things that aren't there in the legislation. You know, otherwise they're overreaching, and then it becomes a judicial government, which we don't want because those people aren't elected. You know, but my vision is policy, so policy that is Ubuntu driven and Ubuntu inspired. So one of my suggestions is a land reform fund where private individuals who own a certain amount of land are taxed. Private corporations are obliged to donate to this fund because private institutions benefited exponentially in South Africa from the exploitation and the dispossession that happened. You know, the cheap labor on mines and the cheap labor on white-owned farms because of dispossession. So they have an obligation, I believe. So the private sector needs to come to the party because right now in South Africa, land reform is government's responsibility. Like it's not our issue. It has nothing to do with us, you know, but it's everyone's issue because I really believe South Africa is at the brink of something big and this is an opportunity. So the private sector, I believe, needs to come to the party. People who own egregious amounts of land need to come to the party, like donate, be taxed. And I think land reform needs to become everyone's problem, not just the government's problem, because when the country implodes, we're all affected. So yeah, that's my vision policy. Yeah. I get this first. No, it's you.
Okay, so I have this great interest in the case. You talked about it, yes, the group boom, the group boom.
The road boom, yeah.
And I think that is an example of what you're speaking of here. Which, do you think land reform and reduction in inequality could help the implementation of decisions like that, which is a great decision, but as you said yesterday, implementation is another issue.
Yeah.
Do you think that if blacks, the Africans, were able to get more wealth and more economic say as opposed to political say in their country, would that allow?
For sure.
Would that allow things like that to happen? A decision like that to be actually implemented?
Yeah. So there are two things to that. So the first, yeah, that's an important question. So the first thing, the thing about South Africa that I think people don't understand is that it's a majority black country and a black government is in power, but the white minority has economic power. So whenever like land reform is brought up, suddenly the rand is weak, suddenly the economy is unstable. So white people in South Africa might be a minority, but they're very powerful because they control the economy. So that's the difficulty, that's the challenge, because governments don't want to upset the white citizens, even though they have a responsibility as beneficiaries of injustice. They have an obligation, but because governments are so afraid of offending or hurting because of what it will do to the economy, because of how the international world will view it, like look at South Africa turning on the minority, so that makes it very difficult for governments to correct and redress what, I think I should have this picture as the background so we all know like what's at stake. So it makes it difficult for governments to redress this because of the economic privilege and just the political power that white people enjoy in the world in general, So it would make a big difference if black people had economic power. It would make it easier to make the society more equitable and more equal. And the other part is there is corruption. There is governmental corruption, and it's a big issue because we could have the best policies in the world, but without the political will to implement those policies properly for the benefit of the people as opposed to a few, we won't get anywhere. So my proposal is that because Ubuntu is so community focused, it should be the community that is running this. So the Land Reform Fund should be operated by people selected by the community, not by the government. The government can do checks and balances. The government can mandate through policy that private people like donate, there's this tax, there's this, but the government should not be involved in administering this fund, I don't believe, because of the corruption and because Ubuntu says we are each other's keepers. We don't need this vertical relationship, horizontal is fine. So I think that would subvert some of the issues.
I'm wondering if there are some models that you have been thinking about of land reform that have worked or that have not worked elsewhere outside of South Africa.
Yeah.
Because one of the issues about South Africa is like isolating itself, saying we are unique, our problem is unique,
Yeah.
so let's look within ourselves to look for solutions. So has there been some thinking outside of South Africa to say here's a solution, here's a model that we could think about, and here's a model that we don't even go there. That's the first thing. The second thing I wanted to find out is, and if you are not comfortable with this,
Yeah.
but I'm thinking about the economic freedom fighters.
Yeah.
They have a very radical solution that they have put on the table. What's your take on that? Like, just take the land. Don't think about compensation. Take the land.
Sure. Okay. The first question is easier, so I'll go with that one first. So that's how I answer a test as well. Easy questions first, and the hard ones I'll figure out in the last 10 minutes. It's so. Someone asked me a similar question this morning. It's so difficult to compare like the South African issue to any other country's issue because like we like to say it's unique. South Africa is the only country to have such a large European settlement. There's no other country in Africa that had such a big group of European settlers in it. Secondly, the systemic nature of dispossession in South Africa is unique. Like, it was well thought out. There were laws, there were policies, like starting from 1652, 1910, 1913. So people think apartheid is when it started, but it started way before then. Dispossession in South Africa was a well thought out, coordinated, systemic, like very smart. Like they did it really well, and that's not common. So it's difficult to compare because no other African country that I can think of has a similar composition demographically and a similar systemic approach to dispossession. But in the same breath, Namibia has similarities with South Africa because they were both colonized and they were both under apartheid. So Namibia also had apartheid to a lesser extent, and also by South African government. So to answer your question, I have looked at Namibia, but Namibia is not a successful example of land reform. They also have issues like South Africa. So they have a similar struggle, but they also haven't resolved it. And the second question about the EFF. People at home are going to be watching this and like, girl, what did you say? Okay. So the EFF is a political party in South Africa. Some people call it radical, other people call it truthful and exactly what we need. And how you view the EFF is determined of a lot of things, So it's very also polarizing. I take the view that yes, the EFF has radical solutions, but I think South Africa needs some radical solutions. So I don't think take the land and deal with the repercussions later is the proper approach at all. But I do think that they brought the conversation of land reform to the table. Before the EFF, no one really spoke about land reform. Like, we lived like this, and we just accepted it as just the way it is, part of South Africa. But the EFF put land reform on the table. Like, this is an issue. This is unnatural. Let's deal with this. So for that, I think they're important. But in terms of their solutions, I don't think they're long-term enough. I don't think they're considered enough, like the solutions they have to offer. I think sometimes they say what is popular to say. So they say what the people want to hear, like very populist in that way. But I don't see them as unintelligent, like some South Africans have taken the view. I think they put land reform on the table, and that's what we needed. But in terms of, are they the ones to handle land reform going forward? I don't think so. Yeah. Any other questions about land reform in South Africa, about Ubuntu, about Truth and Reconciliation Commission, because I have a lot to say about that also.
Could I ask one more question?
Yeah, of course.
If you would allow me. You mentioned just in one sentence the gendered composition of land ownership. I wonder if you could give a little more explanation of how that came to be and how it affects some of the ideas that you have.
So in my research, I look at like three particular, because like I said, the issues are extensive. So I look at three particular issues as my focus. So I look at the willing seller, willing buyer approach to land acquisition. I look at the lack of support that's given to beneficiaries post land reform. And I look at whether land reform does anything for poverty reduction, which you would think the natural answer is yes, but it's not that clear. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. So I don't really deal with the gender representation aspect, but to speak on that a bit is that because South Africa is also a bit patriarchal, there have been things in the past about women not being able to own land. And so land, when it's being returned, is being returned to men because that's how the lineage was, and also the people who apply are men. So there's a gender inequity in who gets to own land. Yeah, I can't speak too much on that because I haven't investigated that enough, but there's a very severe gender inequity. Yeah, some people have said, like, land reform is for men, like it will benefit men, like, yeah. Oh, yeah.
You mentioned land reform and poverty, and I was kind of thinking about that as we were discussing it, like as you showed the picture of the very wealthy community and the poor community.
Yeah.
Like, I guess one of the things that popped into my head in thinking about this, I guess in kind of an American way, is that, like, so they sold that land to the government, right? The government paid them for it. What's to stop them from just using that money to buy a new luxury condo and still concentrating even more wealth in the white community in that way? And I was wondering if you could talk about that. And I think you said, like, will land reform really lead to a resolution of poverty? Because it's not, we're not the agrarian society, ones where land is valuable, but it's not necessarily like the oil companies and some of the other, mining and some of the massive resource institutions.
Yeah, that's true. Okay, thank you for that. So yes, one, you are right. Like that's the issue with, like, willing seller, willing buyer. So the government's approach to land reform right now is willing seller, willing buyer. So the beneficiary of apartheid that owns the land must be willing to sell the land. So they must be a willing seller. The government is the willing buyer. So the government buys the land on behalf of a land reform beneficiary. Now that's very controversial in South Africa, as you can imagine, because one, what happens is, as a willing seller, I'll sell the land at the highest possible price because it's mine, there's no historical context that's given. So it makes land reform very expensive. And two, there's the issue of the moral issue of how is the government buying land that was stolen? What is the rationale of buying back what was stolen? So we acknowledge in our constitution that there's this injustice, and then we turn around and we go buy the land back. But then the other question is, what's the alternative? Is it expropriation without compensation, which right now is making people lose their minds? So willing seller, willing buyer is criticized heavily for good reason. I criticize it. I think it's ridiculous and it's just morally repugnant. But what's the alternative? What else do we do? Do we expropriate the land and we don't pay? In which case, everyone, it's a Zimbabwe, let's all run, so it's difficult. That's the first thing. The second thing is, sorry, did I forget your second question? Oh, about poverty reduction. Yeah. Okay. So I thought when I started the research that the answer would be, obviously, land reform leads to poverty reduction, but not necessarily is the answer that I've reached. But now, so like you said, we're not an agrarian society anymore, really. So giving people farms, and it doesn't do a lot, and it's competitive, and there are commercial big farms that have been around for years, white-owned farms, and then these beneficiaries come through in the market and they're ill-equipped and the government doesn't offer any more support. Like, we give you the land, that's enough. So it's very difficult, and some studies have shown that it has changed the lives of some people. Some studies have shown people's lives stayed the same and they abandoned the farm in the long run. So it's different, like what criteria do you use to measure poverty reduction? Like, there's so many questions, like when do you start measuring and what other factors you have to take into account? So it's a complicated answer of whether or not it reduces poverty, but my thing is there are other important considerations. So one, a place of residence, that goes a long way. So I might still be poor, but now I have a roof over my head, Two, the symbolic importance of your own land. You can have traditional ceremonies happen. You can do a lot more than a person who doesn't own land. And also symbolically, land means a lot to Africans, more than just materially. So when a person is born, the umbilical cord is buried in their homestead in Black African society. Like a common way of asking where someone comes from is to ask, where's your umbilical cord buried? It sounds less weird in vernacular. It sounds weird in English, you know, but it sounds less weird in vernacular. You're like, oh, so where are you from? Where, in Kabayako EP, you know, where's your umbilical cord buried, you know? So there's that, like land means so much more than just what it can do for us. It's also a connection to the ancestors they buried in the land. So it's a connection to the newborns, people who arrive and the people who are departed. So there's so much value. And also just symbolically the redress of this was my ancestors' land and now it's my land, you know? So I think whether or not it leads to poverty reduction is still an open-ended question, but land is still important and land reform still must happen regardless. And also what I found is where there is support, where there is a desire to assist, there is more poverty reduction. So it's difficult to assess now because people are not supported, so they're not helped. So because in the past, white people were given every single opportunity to be successful with land reform, like with agriculture. They were given land grants, they were given, you know, subsidies, tax-free this, like there was a land bank, you could make loans, you bought land for the cheapest prices possible, and now what Black beneficiaries are getting is, here's the land, goodbye. None of that additional support that white farmers had. So it's, yeah. Yeah. No, she was pointing at you.
So, once again, thank you for your presentation. I think my question has to deal with, at least from your perspective, when discussing the idea of land reform, right? That is it a starting point to a bigger conversation, at least in terms of equity in South Africa? And do we, you know, deal with land reform as this one issue, or at least in terms of policy? Do you address it from, like you're saying, these subsidy issues, support issues that come with it, where the land is located, access to markets, all these other kind of substantive issues that come with poverty alleviation, right, and socioeconomic development? Do we deal with this as like this one issue first and then get to other things? Or do we look at it from what other kind of external factors affect the viability of land reform discourse? Yeah, no, for sure. Like, I'm glad you asked that, because two things. The first thing is that people say land, like we want land, but what they mean is we want equality. So we want land, yes, but also land in South Africa stands for everything else that's wrong. So access to healthcare, the inequality, you know, access to housing, access to education, access to proper sanitation, like all of these other issues, all of this, employment, safety, like every other injustice is represented by land. So that is why it's such an emotional and charged topic in South Africa, because it doesn't exist in isolation. It's like, we don't have land, we don't have housing, we don't have healthcare, we don't have education, we don't have options, we don't have employment. It's every other issue, then it becomes, we want land. We want land, we want land, we want it now. You know, and it's the land itself, but it's also every other thing. It's equality, it's equity, it's justice. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, when we talk about land reform, we are talking about the success or failure of it, everything else that's not done. So the government seems to take an approach of land reform means buying this from these people, giving it to these people, and then we're out. We've done our part. But it's not working that way, and it's illogical that way, because people require so much more. Or like, where is this land placed? Because there have been instances of people applying for agricultural land, and they get land that is so far from their place of residence that it's untenable. So these are poor people in the first place. Now you give me land, I'm in the Eastern Cape, now I have land in Limpopo. I mean, I've never been to Limpopo, and what must happen now, you know? So the government is sometimes very reckless and almost uncaring in how they address the land reform issue. It's almost like just ticking the box, you know? So not making sure that the people got it, it's close to them, it's what they wanted, they have the means to work the land.
can check up on them 3 months later, how's it going, check up on them after a year, how's it going, you know. They also have this use it or lose it policy, where it's either you use the land or we take it back. Not we support you, and then we give you more time, and then we give you the land, we come back after 10 years, we're like, this farm is not doing a lot, we're taking it, we're giving it to someone else. You know, they have this very uncaring and uncritical approach to land reform that just seems like they're just ticking off boxes. So that is highly criticized in academia. I criticize it, and that just seems to be the approach that the government is taking to land reform. Yeah.
Is there any kind of mechanism in the Constitution that can like mitigate the seller and buyer problems, where there's like kind of like an eminent domain where the government just,
yeah,
and makes that redistribution themselves?
Do you know what it is about willing seller, willing buyer that's so like frustrating? It's exactly that. It's because it's a political choice. It's not in the Constitution. So the Constitution has, I wish I had my Constitution here. I don't. But it has factors of like, in Section 25, which is the property clause, it has factors that the government must consider when they're buying the land, factors that affect market value. So these factors include the history of the land, equity, land reform considerations. Like there are 5 factors that the government should consider when buying land that should affect the value of land. So if it's land that was previously owned that is shown to have been taken from, you know, the Khoi people, black people, that's supposed to lower the market value of the land. And land reform considerations are supposed to lower the value of the land. But, so there are all these considerations, all these factors that are in the Constitution that subvert willing seller, willing buyer, that make land more accessible and cheaper for the government to buy. But the government doesn't do that. They don't consider those factors. They just go to the market, buy land, and they're out. They don't look at the factors that are in the Constitution, and that's what frustrates people, because it's like the Constitution says it's not mandatory. It's like these are the things that should be considered, you know. But you are the government. You'll do what you want. But so it's frustrating, and that's the other thing about expropriation without compensation. People are like, why is this necessary in the first place? Because the Constitution allows for all these factors to be taken into account. So there's no need for the government to be paying these like exorbitant prices for land. Like there's no need for that. But it's a political choice. It's a policy. You know, it's not constitutionally based. And yeah, and I guess it's one of those things where the government doesn't want to upset the economic power of the country, so they're trying to keep them happy. But yeah, I don't understand it. I don't know why they insist on willing seller, willing buyer. However, I will say there has been a movement away from that from the government side. So there's this conversation about Section 25 being amended. So people have complained strongly in academia, in case law, in the street about willing seller, willing buyer and how unfair and unjust it is. So the government has voted, the National Assembly has voted to amend Section 25 to allow for expropriation without compensation in certain circumstances. So if the government wants to buy your land and for land reform purposes and you're resistant, then the government can say, okay, we're offering this amount. If you're not taking it, then we're expropriating without compensation. And that's that, you know. So there's that. And then there's also a Property Valuation Act that's been promulgated in 2014 that also like includes all these factors that the government has to take into account before paying for land, like the value of the land. So there's going to be a valuer who's actually going to look at the land and look at all the considerations in the Constitution and determine the price that the government is going to pay for the land as opposed to market value. So.
You talked about how the land is very symbolic about guarding equitable issues.
Mm-hmm.
What were some of the positive outcomes from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission regarding some of those issues?
Do you hear that sound from the South African in front? We said the positive outcomes, they're like, I don't know what you're talking about. Yeah, no, the TRC is very contentious and its legacy in South Africa. I also had the same reaction, but internally, because I know I'm on camera, so I was just like, but, so the positive outcomes with regards to
just addressing some of the inequality perpetually there as an attempt to arrive at equity in the process.
Okay, so this is what I myself, Inga, think of like the TRC process. So I have a chapter in my dissertation where I talk about the TRC, because in the TRC, Ubuntu was discussed, and Ubuntu was a justification for why we're choosing reconciliation over violence, because we're an Ubuntu-based society, because forgiveness, because reconciliation. So I look at the TRC for purposes of learning. So what did they do? What worked? What didn't? So how am I going to modify that for land reform purposes? So I look at TRC and I'm just like, why? Why did you do this? You know? So I understand that South Africa in 1993, 1992 was at the brink of war. You know, I understand that. Like it was bad, it was tense, because it was what's going to happen, you know, or they're going to give up power, or white people are going to give up power, is the National Party going to give up power, or are they going to be forced to give up power? It was intense, it was at the brink of civil war, like a lot of people say. So the government made a choice to, let's talk about this, as opposed to let's fight about this. So let's get together, okay, let's come, you tell us the truth of what happened, like who did you kill as the government? Because you know, during apartheid, like people just disappeared and people slipped on soap in jail and died, you know? People hung themselves even though there was nothing in the cell. Like just weird, mysterious deaths happened all the time. People were lost, left with the police at night, and suddenly they're not there anymore and no one knows what happened to them. So in exchange for the truth about what the government did to people, the different types of violences, in order for the families to know and have that peace, they would get amnesty. So they would come tell the truth and they would get amnesty. And this was apparently restorative justice, you know. So truth, historic acknowledgement of what happened, and the forgiveness, and then there would be reconciliation, all right? The problem with the TRC is that there can't be restorative justice without reparations. So what happened is the truth was told, and then people went back to live their nice lives, and then other people went back to their poverty. And then the same system just continued in a more insidious way. And now, like 25 years later, South Africa, the racial animosity has risen to such high levels. It's worse now than it was in 1993, I would say. The racial animosity in South Africa right now, the racial hostility, inequality has worsened since 1994 in South Africa, can you imagine? The inequality has like worsened, the gap is even bigger now. So I believe that the TRC, like Prof said yesterday, like in our discussion, exchanged reconciliation. So we got the truth, we didn't get the reconciliation. We got the truth, we didn't get the justice. And that's the issue. And even the truth was a half-truth, because there were people who just refused to go testify and nothing happened to them. You know, governmental people just said, we did nothing wrong, and then they moved on with their lives and nothing at all happened. You know, so the TRC, and also the way it defined victims, who were victims and who were perpetrators, and it didn't talk at all about beneficiaries. No one talks about the beneficiaries of apartheid, the beneficiaries of colonialism. It was all the perpetrators, the person who killed, the person who raped, the person who went to go evict those people. No one spoke about the people who benefit, the person who got the house after that other person was evicted. That person wasn't mentioned. The person who got the nice neighborhood because of this law that person made. That person wasn't mentioned. And those are the people that are in South Africa now, the beneficiaries. And now because that disconnect was created, where it was, those are the bad apples, we dealt with them, they got amnesty or whatever happened, or they're dead now. The beneficiaries don't see themselves as responsible in any way, because I didn't do anything, you know? Like, that's not my issue. Like, yes, there's inequality, great, but my dad worked, my grandfather worked, you know, this is our farm. Those old people you're talking about, that has nothing to do with me. So there's that mentality because of this divide that the TRC created of, those are the perpetrators, those are the evil people. Whereas, you know, white people got to watch and be like, oh, terrible what they did, and then they continued living, you know, in this privilege that was manifested by all of what happened, you know. And so now to bring it up 25 years later, but by the way, do you know you are also part of the problem? It's like, oh, how dare you? You know, it's a shocker now because we didn't start from the beginning saying, you know, there were perpetrators, but there were also beneficiaries. And the beneficiaries also need to account, like something needs to happen, otherwise we haven't fixed anything, you know? So yeah, so the TRC, I mean, And also, I just feel like a compelled apology is not an apology. You know, a lot of people, like, they came and they said all these things like, yeah, we did that, we're sorry, got amnesty, bye. But a lot of, there's a surprising amount of people who still think like apartheid wasn't that bad, like people are exaggerating, or, you know, like there wasn't a proper acknowledgement, a reckoning of South Africa of what really happened and what it meant. And, you know, there's a mentality that black people are poor because they're lazy, you know, they don't try hard enough. So it's just, yeah, so, I mean, let me try to be more balanced. So yes, I have a lot of criticisms for the TRC, but I also think, I mean, there's only so much they could have done. You know, they had a budget, they had a mandate, they had to operate within like 3 years, and then they were given the task of fix this country. After centuries of just hell, then it was like these 12 people, you fix all of this. You know, I mean, it was an impossible mandate. But yeah, it wasn't great. Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about the sacrifice of beneficiaries and if that's something that beneficiaries would be willing to do the sacrifice in order to have reconciliation, actual restorative justice?
Yeah.
And what would it take to make that more politically feasible?
That is the question, eh? I've also been grappling with that question. I think what will encourage people to make the necessary sacrifices for United South Africa is the fear of the alternative. And I think people aren't really conscientious of where things can go. You know, there's like this divide in South Africa. There's like a black South Africa and there's like a white South Africa. And yes, we share the same spaces and we see the same things, but the way we interpret what's happening is very different because of, you know, you get to go back to your white South Africa and it's very comfortable, it's very stable. The idea of a civil war is not very alert in your mind. But in black South Africa, like, people are angry, you know, and black South Africans are the majority in the country. And there's a lot of political talk about, you know, people's anger and what people are entitled to and what people should have gotten and they didn't get. And there's also a lot of disillusionment, especially in my generation. So I'm 23. So especially in my generation. So like, South Africa is like the rainbow nation, according to the world. And like, you know, the example of what other countries should be able to do, forgive each other and live, coexist. And my generation is supposedly like the born frees, because we were born after 1994, so we were born free. But the systemic racism is still there. The systemic exclusion is still there, you know, so there's you know, like apartheid ended formally, but systemically, like, it's still insidious, it's there. The inequality is still there, the exclusion is still there. So this generation that was supposedly born free is very disillusioned right now about what freedom means when there's this, you know, and there's such, you go to university with people who have so much more than you do, and it's often along a racial line, and it's disillusioning, it's upsetting, you know. So there's all of that happening in South Africa right now. So I think the fear of being a Zimbabwe, whatever that means, is what's going to motivate, you know, white South Africa to come to the party, because I think, you know, with the EFF and everything else that's happening in the country, they are also starting to realize that there are shifts and there need to be changes or otherwise. So I think it's self-preservation that's going to make them come to the party more than Ubuntu, but whatever it is, as long as it happens, you know. So I think the fear of the alternative, and also just education, you know, I think it's very important to educate people about what happened, because a lot of people don't understand the history of South Africa and the history of dispossession, and I think it's important for the government, as part of implementing land reform fund and taxing people, of educating about why we're doing this. Like, what is the legacy? When you talk about legacy of dispossession, legacy of injustice, what do we mean? Because for a lot of people, like my peers in varsity, are just like, that has nothing to do with me, it has nothing to do with you, you weren't even born yet, like, what are you complaining about, you know? So it's also like ignorance about what's happening in South Africa and what has happened in South Africa and how it translates now. So there needs to be education, and there also needs to be a highlight of what could happen if we don't come together, you know. So it's either Ubuntu or it's war. Let's make a choice, let's make a good choice, So I think that's going to be the, Okay. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you so much, everyone, for coming. You will be hearing from us soon about upcoming events with the Ubuntu Dialogues, and we are also looking to get people involved, so you'll be hearing a lot about more than attending events. We are looking for people to get involved in the project as well. Thank you so much.